Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast as we continue to dive through some of the storylines surrounding the NBA with free agency kicked off and such. And I want to talk about the Chicago Bulls because this has been a team that has been very frustrating the past couple of years. The fact that they understand that they are one of the more prominent brands in the NBA and that they are they have a number of players on their roster that are very talented, and they have just sort of been sitting in mediocrity the past couple of years. Now, to be fair, they made the playoffs just a couple years ago in 2022. Now, they lost in the first round in 5 games, and at that point, that's the season that the Bulls had gotten off to this hot start. They were one of the best defenses in the NBA. That's basically the last time we saw Lonzo Ball play basketball, and it was this exciting team for a number of months, but obviously health was the number one reason that we saw them end up diminishing. We saw less than ideal, you could say, Nikola Vucevic trade that ended up being Franz Wagner and other pieces as well. Patrick Williams hasn't necessarily played out to what their expectations of him were when they drafted him 4th overall in 2020, and it does seem like, this has been a long time coming where the Bulls just needed to make a move. It had been literally 2 years, maybe even 3 years. I think 2021 during that Vucevic trade and the Lowry trade were the last, player for player trades that they made up until just a couple weeks ago when they traded Alex Caruso for Josh Giddey. They were just sort of sitting on, maybe it was the value that they saw in some of their players just wasn't eye to eye with the thoughts of some of these other teams, but it was, just them hanging out in no man's land for a number of years, and they were in play-in tournaments. I always mention here, they almost beat the Heat in 2023. They had a lead with a couple minutes left in the fourth quarter, and they end up blowing that. Then the Heat go on to make the finals, so it's always this butterfly effect thing that I sort of point to. But the reality, the Bulls have just been painfully average, and if you want to go by record, they have been even a little bit worse than that the past couple years. And it now finally seems like they are picking a direction, and they probably did so too long, where there were a number of teams at the trade deadline this past year that were calling about Andre Drummond to potentially acquire him at the deadline. They also had, for whatever it's worth, DeMar DeRozan on an expiring deal where they probably could have gotten at least something for that, knowing that, teams wouldn't have to worry about the long-term commitment of him, but would maybe be willing to give up, call it even a late first-round pick, I don't know, multiple second-round picks, just anything for DeRozan. Now, that being said, the word surrounding the Bulls for a lot of that time as well was the idea that the Bulls were planning on bringing him back, which I'm glad that doesn't seem to be the case now, but, they are going to probably get nothing for him. I think I saw this morning LeBron James just signed his new contract with the Lakers and took a max deal, meaning that there probably isn't the money for DeRozan there, and that the Miami Heat have emerged as the front runner, which is a little bit of an interesting fit. I don't hate it by any means, but I definitely like that idea more than DeRozan just going back to the Bulls to be this experienced player that can play winning basketball, not on a good team, and sort of getting in the way almost a little bit of the development of the younger players. You could make an argument for. Now, DeRozan kept them in a lot of clutch games, which is something that probably isn't the worst thing in the world for development of these young players, to have these, these big time possessions, but ultimately it was all for what? Because ultimately they end up falling out of the playoffs again. And I was just, again, very frustrated with them for a number of years, but I can finally get behind the direction of them at least a little bit. Now, I mentioned Patrick Williams and how he's been a little bit disappointing up to this point in his career, but signed a 5-year, $90 million contract extension. That sounds like a lot, but $18 million a year in today's NBA really isn't all that much, and you're getting a player who has definitely been derailed to some degree because of injuries throughout the course of his career so far. But when you're the Bulls and now finally you are understanding where they're at, now they have Vucevic and Zach LaVine on the roster as things currently stand on the books. I mean, they tried their very hardest to let LaVine go. They're going to have to probably wait until he builds up at least some semblance of stock through this regular season. But, the point being that I don't mind having a little bit of extra money invested into young players if you are a team that isn't going to win in the now. And that's kind of what this Patrick Williams contract feels like to me. They also made the move for Josh Giddey a couple weeks ago. I know that this is another move that a lot of people saw as very, as a bad deal, but I don't see it that way whatsoever for Chicago. Yes, because they're the Thunder and they seem to have this treasure chest that is of draft capital in years to come. Maybe it would have been nice to, add somebody there, but at the same time, you're talking about a young player in Giddey who has promise, is just 21 years old, in exchange for a 30-year player that was about to be on an expiring deal and isn't, a massive threat offensively, even though I love Caruso. He had one of the more efficient years of his career offensively this past year. So I also love the deal for the Thunder in that regards, especially considering Giddey just wasn't a fit, and that is something that I think a lot of people have sort of forgotten about, is the fact that Giddey was good for a period of time there. And I understand there's an argument to say that he was a good team, a good stats, bad team type of player, but I really don't see it that way. Averaged 17 points, 8 rebounds, and 7 assists in 32 games that he has played in his career without Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. So I think that he can actually set the table in a pretty decent way for his teammates. And the Bulls are still far from even having a really exciting young core, but I am just happy for them that they are picking a direction after these years of kind of playing out this string that just wasn't worth it. Because listen, they've made the playoffs once since 2018. And I got the impression, at least, that the ownership group was just kind of comfortable with being in that middle zone, knowing that in Chicago, for the Bulls, they're going to sell out just about every night. So I think the Bulls fans deserve better. And again, they still have a lot of things to work out. Next year is probably going to be a season where they're trying to sell at the deadline, get worse, and position themselves better for 2025. At least that's where I hope this goes. Now, DeMar DeRozan is still a free agent. There is a very real possibility that he could come back to Chicago. So we don't know necessarily if this is definitively where they're going, but it hasn't sounded like contract talks have been all too successful up to this point between Chicago and DeRozan. So that's where we stand there. I just wanted to sort of talk about the Bulls real quick here and maybe give them a little bit of a pat on the back if they are going to choose to actually dive into a rebuild here, but we'll still have to see how that all plays out. But another team that has sort of been almost the opposite of, they were really struggling for a number of years and then emerged onto the scene last season and now are at a weird point in their organization where they don't know if they should continue on with the rebuild or invest heavily into their core, is in the Western Conference with the Houston Rockets. And there were some reports that just came out about that they are unlikely to sign their stars from the 2021 draft class in Josh Green and Alperen Şengün to max contracts. So we are going to be diving into those reports and giving our thoughts on that. But before we do, and be taking our final break, don't go anywhere. We will be right back.